Iran received $220 billion, not from the MOU, but from the JCPOA. Now, everybody knows about the $1.7 billion they received in cold hard cash, but did you know that they also had $100 billion of frozen assets unfrozen, where they were able to access upwards of $55 billion of these frozen assets? But where did the rest of the money come from? The rest of the money came from oil revenue, because with the JCPOA, they were allowed to sell their oil on the open market without any sanctions, and they were able to net approximately $120 billion over a 3-year period before the Trump administration put sanctions back on. And do you know what they spent that approximate $220 billion on? Well, in 2015, their ballistic missiles, comprised of small and medium-range missiles, was about approximately 1,000 missiles. Well, from 2015 to 7 years later, they were able to triple that number to 3,000 ballistic missiles that were medium range, and now we know some go even further into Europe. That's not to mention the drone capability that they've been able to develop, which are relatively cheap drones, and on top of the ring of fire through their terror network that they were able to establish around Israel and honestly globally, because they were the global state sponsor of terror even before 2015. And so all the JCPOA did was fund their ability to be as strong and conduct as much terror as they have done over the last 10 years. And in fact, the major enforcement mechanism that the JCPOA is always touting is snapback sanctions. Well, they snapped back, and Iran was still able to develop their Ring of Fire network, their drone capability, and their missile development capability, to include a MIRV capability, which is the multiple re-entry vehicle capability that they said they were able to accomplish, these are just steps in order that you need to build a nuclear weapon. Because all the JCPOA did beyond funding terror was limit their ability to develop their nuclear capability by way of enriching uranium, of which prior to the JCPOA, they had already enriched up to 20% all the way back in 2010. So it was not a huge leap for them to be restrained at 3.7, I believe it was, and then leap forward to 60%, which they did after the U.S. left the JCPOA. And all the JCPOA champions also ignore the fact that the IAEA was restricted in conducting inspections. So the JCPOA only covered pre-designated civilian locations, and military sites were off limits. And if Iran bothered to grant the IAEA any inspections, there was a 24-day window between the time the IAEA wanted to inspect a site and Iran would let them, making sure they had enough time to ensure it was inspection ready. Fast forward to today, and everyone is trying to compare the JCPOA to the MOU, which honestly are incomparable, because the MOU is just a framework to a deal. And if we were to ever get to that deal, then you could properly compare the JCPOA to that deal. Now, the framework of the MOU speaks about money and sanctions relief given to the IRGC, but these are condition-based sanctions relief metrics that the IRGC has to meet before they receive the cash. The only, in fact, relief they're getting is sanctions relief on oil sales. And on top of that, the MOU is currently frozen because the IRGC has decided to close the strait again. So at most, they will get some sanctions relief and funds from oil sales if ever they decide to acknowledge the MOU. But even then, we will be able to track those funds and seize them whenever we want. Now, if they actually go to spend that money, they are spending on what? Reconstruction efforts of nearly $1 trillion worth of damage. That is another thing that everybody wants to skip over, that is anti-MOU and pro-JCPOA, is that the IRGC have been knocked back down to the ground. They no longer have a stockpile of 3,000 missiles because they've fired at least half of them off, or they've been destroyed. On top of that, the damage to the infrastructure of Iran is systemic and devastating, again, upwards of $1 trillion. So they have to replace all of that over the next many months and years. It's not as if this is a chess game or a game of Risk where you can just reconstitute your troops over a 1-hour life cycle. They have years and years to go to get back to any semblance of where they were just back in 2023. And so the bottom line is that while the MOU is not perfect, it's far and above better than the JCPOA, which all it did was normalize terror, of which I will remind you, from 2022 to 2026, the IRGC conducted upwards of 500 attacks against U.S. troops. And that's a number that does not get talked about nearly enough. Whereas the MOU is a behavioral model, meaning that it is a performance-based deal. It'll lead to a performance-based deal if we ever get that far, where the IRGC is going to have to conduct good behavior to get money for the vast majority of the money that is out there. So anybody that's saying otherwise is just lying to you, because they cannot stand that the JCPOA under Obama was such a terrible deal.